Essay 26 of Modern Essays, selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 26, A Free Man's Worship, by Bertrand Russell. A Free Man's Worship was written in 1902. It was republished by Mr. Russell in 1918 in his volume Mysticism and Logic. It is interesting to note carefully Mr. Russell's view in this fine essay in connection with the fact that he was imprisoned by the British government as a pacifist during the war. Much of Mr. Russell's writing in mathematical and philosophical fields is above the head of the desultory reader, but so stimulating a paper as this one should not be neglected by the moderately inquisitive amateur. Bertrand Russell was born in 1872, studied at Trinity College, Cambridge, and is widely known as a thinker of uncompromising liberalism. To Dr. Faustus in his study, Mephistopheles told the history of the creation, saying, "The endless praises of the choirs of angels had begun to grow wearisome, for after all, did he not deserve their praise? Had he not given them endless joy? Would it not be more amusing to obtain undeserved praise, to be worshipped by beings whom he tortured?" He smiled inwardly and resolved that the great drama should be performed. For countless ages the hot nebula swirled aimlessly through space. At length it began to take shape, the central mass threw off planets, the planets cooled, boiling seas and burning mountains heaved and tossed, from black masses of cloud hot sheets of rain deluged the barely solid crust. And now the first germ of life grew in the depths of the ocean, and developed rapidly in the fructifying warmth into vast forest trees, huge ferns springing from the damp mold, sea monsters breeding, fighting, devouring, and passing away. And from the monsters, as the play unfolded itself, man was born, with the power of thought, the knowledge of good and evil, and the cruel thirst for worship. And man saw that all is passing in this mad, monstrous world, that all is struggling to snatch at any cost a few brief moments of life before death's inexorable decree. And man said, "There is a hidden purpose, could we but fathom it, and the purpose is good, for we must reverence something, and in the visible world there is nothing worthy of reverence." And man stood aside from the struggle, resolving that God intended harmony to come out of chaos by human efforts. And when he followed the instincts which God had transmitted to him from his ancestry of beasts of prey, he called it sin, and asked God to forgive him. But he doubted whether he could be justly forgiven, until he invented a divine plan by which God's wrath was to have been appeased. And seeing the present was bad, he made it yet worse, that thereby the future might be better. And he gave God thanks for the strength that enabled him to forego even the joys that were possible. And God smiled, and when he saw that man had become perfect in renunciation and worship, he sent another sun through the sky, which crashed into man's sun, and all returned again to nebula. "Yes," he murmured, "it was a good play. I will have it performed again." Such in outline, but even more purposeless, more void of meaning, is the world which science presents for our belief. Amid such a world, if anywhere, our ideals henceforward must find a home. That man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. How, in such an alien and inhuman world, can so powerless a creature as man preserve his aspirations untarnished? A strange mystery it is that Nature, omnipotent but blind in the revolutions of her secular hurryings through the abysses of space, has brought forth at last a child, subject still to her power, but gifted with sight, with knowledge of good and evil, with the capacity of judging all the works of his unthinking mother. In spite of death, the mark and seal of the parental control, man is yet free, during his brief years, to examine, to criticize, to know, and in imagination to create. To him alone, in the world with which he is acquainted, this freedom belongs, and in this lies his superiority to the resistless forces that control his outward life. The savage, like ourselves, feels the oppression of his impotence before the powers of nature, but having in himself nothing that he respects more than power, he is willing to prostrate himself before his gods without inquiring whether they are worthy of his worship. Pathetic and very terrible is the long history of cruelty and torture, of degradation and human sacrifice, endured in the hope of placating the jealous gods. Surely the trembling believer thinks, when what is most precious has been freely given, their lust for blood must be appeased, and more will not be required. The religion of Moloch, as such creeds may be generically called, is in essence the cringing submission of the slave, who dare not, even in his heart, allow the thought that his master deserves no adulation. Since the independence of ideals is not yet acknowledged, power may be freely worshipped and receive an unlimited respect, despite its wanton infliction of pain. But gradually, as morality grows bolder, the claim of the ideal world begins to be felt. And worship, if it is not to cease, must be given to gods of another kind than those created by the savage. Some, though they feel the demands of the ideal, will still consciously reject them, still urging that naked power is worthy of worship. Such is the attitude inculcated in God's answer to Job out of the whirlwind. The divine power and knowledge are paraded, but of the divine goodness there is no hint. Such also is the attitude of those who, in our own day, base their morality upon the struggle for survival, maintaining that the survivors are necessarily the fittest. But others, not content with an answer so repugnant to the moral sense, will adopt the position which we have become accustomed to regard as specially religious, maintaining that, in some hidden manner, the world of fact is really harmonious with the world of ideals. Thus man creates God, all-powerful and all-good, the mystic unity of what is and what should be. But the world of fact, after all, is not good, and in submitting our judgment to it, there is an element of slavishness from which our thoughts must be purged. For in all things it is well to exalt the dignity of man by freeing him as far as possible from the tyranny of non-human power. When we have realized that power is largely bad, that man, with his knowledge of good and evil, is but a helpless atom in a world which has no such knowledge, the choice is again presented to us. Shall we worship force, or shall we worship goodness? Shall our God exist and be evil, or shall he be recognized as the creation of our own conscience? The answer to this question is very momentous, and affects profoundly our whole morality. The worship of force, to which Carlyle and Nietzsche and the creed of militarism have accustomed us, is the result of failure to maintain our own ideals against a hostile universe. It is itself a prostrate submission to evil, a sacrifice of our best to Moloch. If strength indeed is to be respected, let us respect rather the strength of those who refuse that false recognition of facts, which fails to recognize that facts are often bad. Let us submit that in the world we know there are many things that would be better otherwise, and that the ideals to which we do and must adhere are not realized in the realm of matter. Let us preserve our respect for truth, for beauty, for the ideal of perfection which life does not permit us to attain, though none of these things meet with the approval of the unconscious universe. If power is bad, as it seems to be, let us reject it from our hearts. In this lies man's true freedom. in determination to worship only the God created by our own love of the good, to respect only the heaven which inspires the insight of our best moments. In action, in desire, we must submit perpetually to the tyranny of outside forces, but in thought, in aspiration, we are free, free from our fellow men, free from the petty planet on which our bodies impotently crawl, free even, while we live, from the tyranny of death. Let us learn, then, that energy of faith which enables us to live constantly in the vision of the good, and let us descend, in action, into the world of fact, with that vision always before us. When first the opposition of fact and ideal grows fully visible, a spirit of fiery revolt, of fierce hatred of the gods, seems necessary to the assertion of freedom. To defy with Promethean constancy a hostile universe, to keep its evil always in view, always actively hated, to refuse no pain that the malice of power can invent, appears to be the duty of all who will not bow before the inevitable. But indignation is still a bondage, for it compels our thoughts to be occupied with an evil world, and in the fierceness of desire from which rebellion springs there is a kind of self-assertion which it is necessary for the wise to overcome. Indignation is a submission of our thoughts, but not of our desires. The Stoic freedom in which wisdom consists is found in the submission of our desires, but not of our thoughts. From the submission of our desires springs the virtue of resignation. From the freedom of our thoughts springs the whole world of art and philosophy, and the vision of beauty, by which, at last, we half conquer the reluctant world. But the vision of beauty is possible only to unfettered contemplation, to thoughts not weighed by the goad of eager wishes. And thus freedom comes only to those who no longer ask of life that it shall yield them any of those personal goods that are subject to the mutations of time. Although the necessity of renunciation is evidence of the existence of evil, yet Christianity, in preaching it, has shown a wisdom exceeding that of the Promethean philosophy of rebellion. It must be admitted that of the things we desire, some, though they prove impossible, are yet real goods. Others, however, as ardently longed for, do not form part of a fully purified ideal. The belief that what must be renounced is bad, though sometimes false, is far less often false than untamed passion supposes. And the creed of religion, by providing a reason for proving that it is never false, has been the means of purifying our hopes by the discovery of many austere truths. But there is in resignation a further good element. Even real goods, when they are unattainable, ought not to be fretfully desired. To every man comes, sooner or later, the great renunciation. For the young there is nothing unattainable. A good thing desired with the whole force of a passionate will, and yet impossible, is to them not credible. Yet by death, by illness, by poverty, or by the voice of duty, we must learn, each one of us, that the world was not made for us, and that, however beautiful may be the things we crave for, fate may nevertheless forbid them. It is the part of courage, when misfortune comes, to bear without repining the ruin of our hopes, to turn away our thoughts from vain regrets. This degree of submission to power is not only just and right, it is the very gate of wisdom. But passive renunciation is not the whole wisdom, for not by renunciation alone can we build a temple for the worship of our own ideals. Haunting foreshadowings of the temple appear in the realm of imagination, in music, in architecture, in the untroubled kingdom of reason, and in the golden sunset magic of lyrics, where beauty shines and glows, remote from the touch of sorrow, remote from the fear of change, remote from the failures and disenchantments of the world of fact. In the contemplation of these things, the vision of heaven will shape itself in our hearts, giving at once a touchstone to judge the world about us, and an inspiration by which to fashion to our needs whatever is not incapable of serving as a stone in the sacred temple. Except for those rare spirits that are born without sin, there is a cavern of darkness to be traversed before that temple can be entered. The gate of the cavern is despair, and its floor is paved with the gravestones of abandoned hopes. There self must die. There the eagerness, the greed of untamed desire must be slain, for only so can the soul be freed from the empire of fate. But out of the caverns the gate of renunciation leads again to the daylight of wisdom, by whose radiance a new insight, a new joy, a new tenderness shine forth to gladden the pilgrim's heart. When, without the bitterness of impotent rebellion, we have learnt both to resign ourselves to the outward rule of fate and to recognize that the non-human world is unworthy of our worship, it becomes possible at last so to transform and refashion the unconscious universe, so to transmute it in the crucible of imagination, that a new image of shining gold replaces the old idol of clay. In all the multiform facts of the world, in the visual shapes of trees and mountains and clouds, in the events of the life of man, even in the very omnipotence of death, the insight of creative idealism can find the reflection of a beauty which its own thoughts first made. In this way mind asserts its subtle mastery over the thoughtless forces of nature. The more evil the material with which it deals, the more thwarting to untrained desire, the greater is its achievement in inducing the reluctant rock to yield up its hidden treasures, the prouder its victory in compelling the opposing forces to swell the pageant of its triumph. Of all the arts, tragedy is the proudest, the most triumphant, for it builds its shining citadel in the very center of the enemy's country, on the very summit of his highest mountain. From its impregnable watchtowers, his camps and arsenals, his columns and forts, are all revealed. Within its walls the free life continues, while the legions of death and pain and despair, and all the servile captains of tyrant fate, afford the burghers of that dauntless city new spectacles of beauty. Happy those sacred ramparts, thrice happy the dwellers on that all-seeing eminence. Honor to those brave warriors who through countless ages of warfare have preserved for us the priceless heritage of liberty, and have kept undefiled by sacrilegious invaders the home of the unsubdued. But the beauty of tragedy does not make visible a quality which in more or less obvious shapes is present always and everywhere in life. In the spectacle of death, in the endurance of intolerable pain, and in the irrevocableness of a vanished past, there is a sacredness, an overpowering awe, a feeling of the vastness, the depth, the inexhaustible mystery of existence, in which, as by some strange marriage of pain, the sufferer is bound to the world by bonds of sorrow. In these moments of insight we lose all eagerness of temporary desire, all struggling and striving for petty ends, all care for the little trivial things that, to a superficial view, make up the common life of day by day. We see, surrounding the narrow raft illumined by the flickering light of human comradeship, the dark ocean on whose rolling waves we toss for a brief hour. From the great night without, a chill blast breaks in upon our refuge. All the loneliness of humanity amid hostile forces is concentrated upon the individual soul, which must struggle alone, with what of courage it can command, against the whole weight of a universe that cares nothing for its hopes and fears. Victory in the struggle with the powers of darkness is the true baptism into the glorious company of heroes, the true initiation into the overmastering beauty of human existence. From that awful encounter of the soul with the outer world, renunciation, wisdom, and charity are born, and with their birth a new life begins. To take into the inmost shrine of the soul the irresistible forces whose puppets we seem to be, death and change, the irrevocableness of the past, and the powerlessness of man before the blind hurry of the universe from vanity to vanity, to feel these things and know them is to conquer them. This is the reason why the past has much magical power. The beauty of its motionless and silent pictures is like the enchanted purity of late autumn, when the leaves, though one breath would make them fall, still glow against the sky in golden glory. The past does not change or strive. Like Duncan after life's fitful fever, it sleeps well. What was eager and grasping, what was petty and transitory, has faded away. The things that are beautiful and eternal shine out of it like stars in the night. Its beauty to a soul not worthy of it is unendurable, but to a soul which has conquered fate it is the key of religion. The life of man, viewed outwardly, is but a small thing in comparison with the forces of nature. The slave is doomed to worship time and fate and death because they are greater than anything he finds in himself, and because all his thoughts are of things which they devour. But great as they are, to think of them greatly, to feel their passionless splendor, is greater still. And such thought makes us free men. We no longer bow before the inevitable in Oriental subjection, but we absorb it and make it a part of ourselves. To abandon the struggle for private happiness, to expel all eagerness of temporary desire, to burn with passion for eternal things, this is emancipation, and this is the free man's worship. And this liberation is effected by a contemplation of fate. For fate itself is subdued by the mind, which leaves nothing to be purged by the purifying fire of time. United with his fellow men by the strongest of all ties, the tie of a common doom, the free man finds that a new vision is with him always, shedding over every daily task the light of love. The life of man is a long march through the night, surrounded by invisible foes, tortured by weariness and pain, towards a goal that few can hope to reach, and where none may tarry long. One by one, as they march, our comrades vanish from our sight, seized by the silent orders of omnipotent death. Very brief is the time in which we can help them, in which their happiness or misery is decided. Be it ours to shed sunshine on their path, to lighten their sorrows by the balm of sympathy, to give them the pure joy of a never-tiring affection, to strengthen failing courage, to instill faith in hours of despair. Let us not weigh in grudging scales their merits and demerits, but let us think only of their need, of the sorrows, the difficulties, perhaps the blindness, that make the misery of their lives. Let us remember that they are fellow sufferers in the same darkness, actors in the same tragedy with ourselves. And so, when their day is over, when their good and their evil have become eternal by the immortality of the past, be it ours to feel that where they suffered, where they failed, no deed of ours was the cause. But wherever a spark of the divine fire kindled in their hearts, we were ready with encouragement, with sympathy, with brave words in which high courage glowed. Brief and powerless is man's life. On him and on his race the slow, sure doom falls, pitiless and dark. Blind to good and evil, reckless of destruction, omnipotent matter rolls on its relentless way. For man, condemned today to lose his dearest, tomorrow himself to pass through the gate of darkness, it remains only to cherish, ere yet the blow falls, the lofty thoughts that ennoble his little day; disdaining the coward terrors of the slave of fate, to worship at the shrine that his own hands have built; undismayed by the empire of chance, to preserve a mind free from the wanton tyranny that rules his outward life; proudly defiant of the irresistible forces that tolerate, for a moment, his knowledge and his condemnation, to sustain alone a weary but unyielding Atlas, the world that his own ideals have fashioned, despite the trampling march of unconscious power. End of Essay 26. Essay 27 of Modern Essays, selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 27, Some Historians, by Philip Guedalla. Philip Guedalla, born 1889, is a London barrister and at the present time an independent Liberal candidate for the House of Commons. He has written excellent light verse and parodies and a text-book on European history, 1715 to 1815. His most conspicuous achievement so far is the brilliant volume Supers and Supermen, from which my selection is taken. Supers and Supermen is a collection of historical and political portraits and skits. It is mercilessly and gloriously humorous. Those who can always follow the wit and irony that Guedalla knows how to conceal in a cunningly turned phrase will find the book a prodigious delight. He has an unerring eye for the absurd. His paradoxes, when pondered, have a way of proving excellent truth. Truth is sometimes like the furniture in Through the Looking-Glass, which could only be reached by resolutely walking away from it. 10 years ago Mr. Guedalla was considered the most continuously and insolently brilliant undergraduate of the Oxford of that day. The charm and vigor of his ironical wit have not lessened since his fellow undergraduates strove to convince themselves that no man could be as clever as P.G. seemed to be. When Mr. Guedalla holds the mirror up to Nietzsche, or gives thanks that Britons never, never will be Slavs, or dynastizes Henry James into 3 reigns, James I, James II, and the Old Pretender, or when he speaks of the cheerful clatter of Sir James Barrie's cans as he went round with the milk of human kindness, there will be some who will sigh. But there will also, I hope, be many who will forgive the bravado for the quicksilver wit. It was Quintilian, or Mr. Max Beerbohm, who said, "History repeats itself. Historians repeat each other." The saying is full of the mellow wisdom of either writer, and stamped with the peculiar veracity of the Silver Age of Roman or British epigram. One might have added, if the aphorist had stayed for an answer, that history is rather interesting when it repeats itself. Historians are not. In France, which is an enlightened country enjoying the benefits of the Revolution and a public examination in rhetoric, historians are expected to write in a single and classical style of French. The result is sometimes a rather irritating uniformity. It is one long tane that has no turning, and any quotation may be attributed with safety to Guizot, because "La nuit tous les chats sont gris." But in England, which is a free country, the restrictions natural to ignorant and immoral foreigners are put off by the rough island race, and history is written in a dialect which is not curable by education, and cannot, it would seem, be prevented by injunction. Historian's English is not a style, it is an industrial disease. The thing is probably scheduled in the Workmen's Compensation Act, and the publisher may be required upon notice of the attack to make a suitable payment to the writer's dependents. The workers in this dangerous trade are required to adopt, like Mahomet's coffin, a detached standpoint; that is, to write as if they took no interest in the subject. Since it is not considered good form for a graduate of less than 60 years' standing to write upon any period that is either familiar or interesting, this feeling is easily acquired, and the resulting narrations present the dreary impartiality of the recording angel, without that completeness which is the sole attraction of his style. Wilde complained of Mr. Hall Caine that he wrote at the top of his voice, but a modern historian, when he is really detached, writes like someone talking in the next room, and few writers have equaled the legal precision of Cox's observation that the Turks sawed the Archbishop and the Commandant in half and committed other grave violations of international law. Having purged his mind of all unsteadying interest in the subject, the young historian should adopt a moral code of more than Malthusian severity, which may be learned from any American writer of the last century upon the Renaissance or the decadence of Spain. This manner, which is especially necessary in passages dealing with character, will lend to his work the grave dignity that is requisite for translation into Latin prose, that supreme test of an historian's style. It will be his misfortune to meet upon the byways of history the oddest and most abnormal persons, and he should keep by him, unless he wishes to forfeit his fellowship, some convenient formula by which he may indicate at once the enormity of the subject and the disapproval of the writer. The writings of Lord Macaulay will furnish him at need with the necessary facility in lightning characterization. It was the practice of Cicero to label his contemporaries without distinction as heavy men, and the characters of history are easily divisible into far-seeing statesmen and reckless libertines. It may be objected that although it is sufficient for the purposes of contemporary caricature to represent Mr. Gladstone as a collar or Mr. Chamberlain as an eyeglass, it is an inadequate record for posterity. But it is impossible for a busy man to write history without formula, and, after all, sheep are sheep and goats are goats. Lord Macaulay once wrote of someone, "In private life he was stern, morose, and inexorable. He was probably a Dutchman." It is a passage which has served as a lasting model for the historian's treatment of character. I had always imagined that Cliché was a suburb of Paris until I discovered it to be a street in Oxford. Thus, if the working historian is faced with a period of deplorable excesses, he handles it like a man, and writes always as if he was illustrated with steel engravings. The imbecile King now ripened rapidly towards a crisis. Surrounded by a court in which inanity of the day was rivaled only by the debauchery of the night, he became incapable towards the year 1472 of distinguishing good from evil, a fact which contributed considerably to the effectiveness of his foreign policy, but was hardly calculated to conform with the monastic traditions of his house. Long nights of drink and dicing weakened a constitution that was already undermined, and the council table, where once Campo Santo had presided, was disfigured with the despicable apparatus of bagatelle. The burghers of the capital were horrified by the wild laughter of his madcap courtiers, and when it was reported in London that Ladislaus had played at Halma, the court of St. James received his envoy in the deepest ceremonial mourning. That is precisely how it is done. The passage exhibits the benign and contemporary influences of Lord Macaulay and Mr. Bowdler, and it contains all the necessary ingredients, except perhaps a venal chancellor and a greedy mistress. Vice is a subject of especial interest to historians, who are in most cases residents in small county towns, and there is unbounded truth in the rococo footnote of a writer on the Renaissance, who said apropos of a pope, "The disgusting details of his vices smack somewhat of the morbid historian's lamp." The note itself is a fine example of that concrete visualization of the subject which led Macaulay to observe that in consequence of Frederick's invasion of Silesia, black men fought on the coast of Coromandel, and red men scalped each other by the Great Lakes of North America. A less exciting branch of the historian's work is the reproduction of contemporary sayings and speeches. Thus, an obituary should always close on a note of regretful quotation. "He lived in affluence and died in great pain." Thus it was said by the most eloquent of his contemporaries, "Thus terminated a career as varied as it was eventful, as strange as it was unique." But for the longer efforts of sustained eloquence, greater art is required. It is no longer usual, as in Thucydides' day, to compose completely new speeches, but it is permissible for the historian to heighten the colors and even to insert those rhetorical questions and complexes of personal pronouns which will render the translation of the passage into Latin prose a work of consuming interest and lasting profit. "The Duke assembled his companions for the forlorn hope and addressed them briefly in oratio obliqua. His father, he said, had always cherished in his heart the idea that he would one day return to his own people. Had he fallen in vain? Was it for nothing that they had dyed with their loyal blood the soil of 100 battlefields? The past was dead, the future was yet to come. Let them remember that great sacrifices were necessary for the attainment of great ends. Let them think of their homes and families, and if they had any pity for an exile, an outcast, and an orphan, let them die fighting. That is the kind of passage that used to send the blood of Dr. Bradley coursing more quickly through his veins. The march of its eloquence, the solemnity of its sentiment, and the rich balance of its pronouns unite to make it a model for all historians. It can be adapted for any period. It is not possible, in a short review, to include the special branches of the subject. Such are those efficient modern textbooks in which events are referred to either as factors, as if they were a sum, or as phases, as if they were the moon. There is also the solemn business of writing economic history, in which the historian may lapse at will into algebra, and anything not otherwise describable may be called social tissue. A special subject is constituted by the early conquests of Southern and Central America. In these there is a uniform opening for all passages running, "It was now the middle of October, and the season was drawing to an end. Soon the mountains would be whitened with the snows of winter, and every rivulet swollen to a roaring torrent. Cortez, whose determination only increased with misfortune, decided to delay his march until the inclemency of the season abated. It was now the middle of November, and the season was drawing to an end." There is, finally, the method of military history. This may be patriotic, technical, or in the manner prophetically indicated by Virgil as bellic, haurida bellic. The finest exponent of the patriotic style is undoubtedly the Rev. W. H. Fitchett, a distinguished colonial clergyman and historian of the Napoleonic Wars. His night attacks are more nocturnal, and his scaling parties are more heroically scaligerous than those of any other writer. His drummer boys are the most moving in my limited circle of drummer boys. One gathers that the Peninsular War was full of pleasing incidents of this type. The night attack. It was midnight when Staff Surgeon Pettigrew showed the flare from the summit of Sombrero. At once the whole plain was alive with the hum of the great assault. The 4 columns speedily got into position with flares and bugles at the head of each. One made straight for the Watergate, a second for the Bailey Guard, a third for the Porterhouse, and the last, led by the saintly Smeeth, for the Tube Station. Let us follow the 2nd column in its secret mission through the night, lit by torches and cheered on by the huzzas of 1,000 English throats. "Blank the blanks!" cried Cocker in a voice hoarse with patriotism. At that moment a red-hot shot hurtled over the plain and, ricocheting treacherously from the frozen river, dashed the heroic leader to the ground. Captain Boffskin of the Buffs leaped up with the dry, coughing howl of the British infantryman. "Blank them!" he roared, "and blank them to blank!" And for the last 50 yards it was neck and neck with the ladders. Our gallant drummer boys laid to again, but suddenly a shot rang out from the silent ramparts. The 94th Léger were awake. We were discovered. The War of 1870 requires more special treatment. Its histories show no particular characteristic, but its appearance in fiction deserves special attention. There is a standard pattern. How the Prussians came to Vitry-le-Sec. It was a late afternoon in early September, or an early afternoon in late September (I forget these things), when I missed the boat expressed from Kerplouarnec to Pouilly-le-Roi, and was forced by the time-table to spend 3 hours at the forgotten hamlet of Vitry-le-Sec, in the heart of Dauphiné. It contained, besides a quantity of underfed poultry, 1 white church, 1 white mairie, and 9 white houses. An old man with a white beard came towards me up the long white road. "It was on such an afternoon as this 40 years ago," he began, "that—" "Stop!" I said sharply. "I have met you in a previous existence. You are going to say that a solitary Ulan appeared sharply outlined against the sky behind Monsieur Jules' farm." He nodded feebly. "The red trousers had left the village half an hour before to look for the hated Prussian in the cafés of the neighboring town. You were alone when the spiked helmets marched in. You can hear their shrieking fifes to this day." He wept quietly. I went on. "There was an officer with them, a proud, ugly man with a butter-colored moustache. He saw the little Mimi and drove his coarse Swabian hand upward through his Mecklenburger moustache. You dropped on one knee." But he had fled. "In the first of the 3 cafés I saw a second old man. 'Come in, monsieur,' he said. I waited on the doorstep. 'It was on just such an afternoon,' I went on. 'At the other 2 cafés 2 further old men attempted me with the story. I told the last that he was rescued by Zouaves, and walked happily to the station to read about Vichy Célestins until the train came in from the south.'" The Russo-Japanese War is a more original subject, and derives its particular flavor from the airy grace with which Sir Ian Hamilton has described it. Like this: "Wah wah, January 31. The Rafale was purring like a mistral as I shaved this morning. I wonder where it is. Must ask Blank. Blank is a charming fellow with the face of a Baluchi Kashki and a voice like a circular saw. 11:40. It was 11:40 when I looked at my watch. The shrapnel bursts looked like a plantation of powder puffs suspended in the sky. Victor says there is a battle going on. Capital chap, Victor. 2 p.m. Lunched with an American lady doctor. How feminine the Americans can be. 7 p.m. A great day. It was Donkelsdorp over again. Substitute the 10th Army for the Traffordshire's baggage wagon. Swell honk Spreet into the roaring Wang Ho. Elevate Kopp into the frowning scarp of Pidgiyama. And you have it. The staff were obviously gratified when I told them about Donkelsdorp. The Ruskies came over the crest line in a huddle of massed battalions, and Gazika was after him like a rat after a terrier. I knew that his horse guns had no horses, a rule of the Japanese service to discourage unnecessary changing of ground. But his men bit the trails and dragged them up by their teeth. Slowly the Muscovites peeled off the steaming mountain and took the funicular down the other side. I wonder what my friend Smuts would make of the Yen Tai coal mine. Well, well. Something accomplished, something done. The technical manner is more difficult of acquisition for the beginner, since it involves a knowledge of at least 2 European languages. It is a cardinal rule that all places should be described as point d'appui. The simple process of scouting looks far better as Verschleierung, and the adjective strategical may be used without any meaning in front of any noun. But the military manner was revolutionized by the war. Mr. Belloc created a new land and a new water. We know now why the Persian commanders demanded earth and water on their entrance into a Greek town. It was the weekly demand of the great General Staff, as it called for its favorite paper. Mr. Belloc has woven Baedeker and geometry into a new style. It is the last cry of historians' English, because one was invented by a German and the other by a Greek. End of Essay 27. Essay 28 of Modern Essays, selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 28, Winter Mist, by Robert Palfrey Utter. Robert Palfrey Utter was born in 1875 in Olympia, Washington. He graduated from Harvard. I am sorry there are so many Harvard men in this book. I didn't know they were Harvard men until too late. In 1898, and took his Ph.D. there in 1906. After a varied experience, including editorial work on The Youth's Companion, reporting on the New York Evening Post, ranching in Mexico, and graduate study at Harvard, he went to Amherst 1906 to 18 as Associate Professor of English. He was on the faculty of the A.E.F. University at Bonn, France, 1919, and in 1920 became Associate Professor of English at the University of California. Mr. Utter has contributed largely to the magazines, and has published Guide to Good English, 1914, Everyday Words and Their Uses, 1916, and Everyday Pronunciation, 1918. Former students of his at Amherst have told me of the lasting stimulus his teaching has given them. That he can beautifully practice what he preaches of the art of writing, this essay shows. From a magazine with a rather cynical cover, I learned very recently that for pond skating the proper costume is brown homespun with a fur collar on the jacket, whereas for private rinks one wears a gray herringbone suit and taupe-colored alpine. Oh, barren years that I have been a skater, and no one told me of this! And here's another thing. I was patiently trying to acquire a counter-turn under the idle gaze of a hockey player who had no better business, till the others arrived, than to watch my efforts. "What I don't see about that game," he said at last, "is who wins." It had never occurred to me to ask. He looked bored, and I remembered that the pictures in the magazine showed the wearers of the careful costumes for rink and pond skating as having rather blank eyes that looked illimitably bored. I have hopes of the rocker and the mohawk. I might acquire a proper costume for skating on a small river if I could learn what it is, but a bored look? Why, even hockey does not bore me, unless I stop to watch it. I don't wonder that those who play it look bored. Even Alexander, who played a more imaginative game than hockey, was bored. Poor fellow, he should have taken up fancy skating in his youth. I never heard of a human being who pretended to a complete conquest of it. I like pond skating best by moonlight. The hollow among the hills will always have a bit of mist about it, let the sky be clear as it may. The moonlight, which seems so lucid and brilliant when you look up, is all pearl and smoke round the pond and the hills. The shore that was like iron under your heel as you came down to the ice is vague when you look back at it from the center of the pond, as the memory of a dream. The motion is like flying in a dream. You float free, and the world floats under you. Your velocity is without effort and without accomplishment, for, speed as you may, you leave nothing behind and approach nothing. You look upward. The mist is overhead now. You see the moon in a hollow halo at the bottom of an icy crystal cup, and you yourself are in just such another. The mist, palely opalescent, drives past her out of nothing into nowhere. Like yourself, she is the center of a circle of vague limit and vaguer content, where passes a swift, ceaseless stream of impression through a faintly luminous halo of consciousness. If by moonlight the mist plays upon the emotions like faint, bewitching music, in sunlight it is scarcely less. More often than not, when I go for my skating to our cozy little river, a winding mile from the mill dam to the railroad trestle, the hills are clothed in silver mist which frames them in vignettes with blurred edges. The tone is that of Japanese paintings on white silk, their color showing soft and dull through the frost powder with which the air is filled. At the mill dam the hockey players furiously rage together, but I heed them not, and in a moment am beyond the first bend, where their clamor comes softened on the air like that of a distant convention of politic crows. The silver powder has fallen on the ice, just enough to cover earlier tracings and leave me a fresh plate to etch with grapevines and arabesques. The stream winds ahead like an unbroken road, striped across with soft edge shadows of violet, indigo, and lavender. On one side it is bordered with leaning birch, oak, maple, hickory, and occasional groups of hemlocks, under which the very air seems tinged with green. On the other, rounded masses of scrub oak and alder roll back from the edge of the ice like clouds of reddish smoke. The river narrows and turns, then spreads into a swamp, where I weave my curves round the straw-colored tussocks. Here, new as the snow is, there are earlier tracks than mine. A crow has traced his parallel hieroglyph, alternate footprints with long dashes where he trailed his middle toe as he lifted his foot and his spur as he brought it down. Under a low shrub that has hospitably scattered its seed is a dainty, close-wrought embroidery of tiny bird feet in irregular curves woven into a circular pattern. A silent glide towards the bank, where among bare twigs little forms flit and swing with low conversational notes, brings me in company with a working crew of pine siskins, methodically rifling seed cones of birch and alder, chattering sotto voce the while. Under a leaning hemlock the writing on the snow tells of a squirrel that dropped from the lowest branch, hopped aimlessly about for a few yards, then went up the bank. Further on, where the river narrows again, a flutter-headed rabbit crossing at top speed has made a line seemingly as free from frivolous indirection as if it had been defined by all the ponderosities of mathematics. There is no pursuing track. Was it his own shadow he fled, or the shadow of Hawk? The mist now lies along the base of the hills, leaving the upper ridges almost imperceptibly veiled and the rounded tops faintly softened. The snowy slopes are etched with brush and trees so fine and soft that they remind me of Dürer's engravings, the fur of St. Jeremy's lion, the cock's feathers in the coat of arms with the skull. From behind the veil of the southernmost hill comes a faint note, as from undiscoverable lips that blow an immaterial horn. It is the first far premonition of the noon train. I pause and watch long for the next sign. At last I hear its throbbing, which ceases as it pauses at the flag station under the hill. There the invisible locomotive shoots a column of silver vapor above the surface of the mist, breaking in rounded clouds at the top, looking like nothing so much as the photograph of the explosion of a submarine mine, a titanic outburst of force in static pose, a geyser of atomized water standing like a frosted elm tree. Then quick puffs of dusky smoke, the volley of which does not reach my ear till the train has stuck its black head out of fairyland and become a prosaic reminder of dinner. High on its narrow trestle it leaps across my little river and disappears between the sandbanks. Far behind it the mist is again spreading into its even layers. Silence is renewed, and I can hear the musical creaking of 4 starlings in an apple tree as they eviscerate a few rotten apples on the upper branches. I turn and spin down the curves and reaches of the river without delaying for embroideries or arabesques. At the mill dam the hockey game still rages. The players take no heed of the noon train. Let Zal and Rustum bluster as they will, or Hatim call to supper. Their minds and eyes are intent on a battered disk of hard rubber. I begin to think I have misjudged them when I consider what effort of imagination must be involved in the concentration of the faculties on such an object, transcending the call of hunger and the lure of beauty. Is it to them, as is to the mystic, the great syllable Om, whereby he attains nirvana? I cannot attain it. I can but wonder what the hockey players win one half so precious as the stuff they miss. End of Essay 28. Essay 29 of Modern Essays, selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 29, Trivia, by Logan Pearsall Smith. It would be extravagant to claim that Pearsall Smith's Trivia, the remarkable little book from which these miniature essays are extracted, is well known. It is too daintily, fragile, and absurd and sophisticated to appeal to a very large public. But it has a cohort of its own devotees and fanatics, and since its publication in 1917 it has become a sort of password in a secret brotherhood or intellectual suicide club. I say suicide advisedly, for Mr. Smith's irony is glitteringly edged. Its incision is so keen that the reader is often unaware the razor edge has turned against himself until he perceives the wound to be fatal. Pearsall Smith was in a way one of the men of the 90s, but he had repressions. An excellent thing to have, brothers. Most of the great literature is founded on judicious repressions. He came of an excellent old intellectual Quaker family down in the Philadelphia region. His father, if we remember rightly, was one of Walt Whitman's staunchest friends in the Camden days. But when the strong wine of the 90s was foaming in the vats and noggins, Mr. Smith, so we imagine it at least, was still too close to that guarded education in morals and manners that he had had at Haverford College, Pennsylvania, and further tinctured with docility at Harvard and Balliol, to give full rein to his inward gush of hilarious satirics. Like a strong, silent man, he held in that wellspring of champagne and mercury until many, many years later. When it came out, in 1902 he first began to print his trivia privately. The book was published by Doubleday in 1917. It sparkled all the more tenderly for its long cellarage. But we must be statistical. Logan Pearsall Smith was born at Melville, New Jersey, in 1865. As a boy he lived in Philadelphia and Germantown. Do you know Germantown? It is a foothill of that mountain range whereof Parnassus and Olivet are twin peaks, and was 3 years at Haverford in the class of '85. He went to Harvard for a year, then to Balliol College, Oxford, where he took his degree in 1893. Ever since then, he has lived in England. Stonehenge. They sit there forever on the dim horizon of my mind, that Stonehenge circle of elderly disapproving faces, faces of the uncles and schoolmasters and tutors who frowned on my youth. In the bright center and sunlight I leap, I caper, I dance my dance. But when I look up I see they are not deceived. For nothing ever placates them, nothing ever moves to a look of approval that ring of bleak, old, contemptuous faces. The stars. Battling my way homeward one dark night against the wind and rain, a sudden gust, stronger than the others, drove me back into the shelter of a tree. But soon the western sky broke open, the illumination of the stars poured down from behind the dispersing clouds. I was astonished at their brightness, to see how they filled the night with their soft lustre. So I went my way accompanied by them. Arcturus followed me, and becoming entangled in a leafy tree, shone by glimpses, and then emerged triumphant, lord of the western sky. Moving along the road in the silence of my own footsteps, my thoughts were among the constellations. I was one of the princes of the starry universe. In me also there was something that was not insignificant and mean and of no account. The spider. What shall I compare it to, this fantastic thing I call my mind? To a waste paper basket, to a sieve choked with sediment, or to a barrel full of floating froth and refuse? No, what it is really most like is a spider's web, insecurely hung on leaves and twigs, quivering in every wind and sprinkled with dewdrops and dead flies. And at its center, pondering forever the problem of existence, sits motionless the spider-like and uncanny soul. L'oiseau bleu. What is it, I have more than once asked myself, what is it that I am looking for in my walks about London? Sometimes it seems to me as if I were following a bird, a bright bird that sings sweetly as it floats about from one place to another. When I find myself, however, among persons of middle age and settled principles, see them moving regularly to their offices, what keeps them going, I ask myself, and I feel ashamed of myself and my bird. There is, though, a philosophic doctrine, I studied it at college, and I know that many serious people believe it, which maintains that all men, in spite of appearances and pretensions, all live alike for pleasure. This theory certainly brings portly, respected persons very near to me. Indeed, with a sense of low complicity, I have sometimes watched a bishop. Was he, too, on the hunt for pleasure, solemnly pursuing his bird? I see the world. "But you go nowhere, see nothing of the world," my cousins said. Now, though I do go sometimes to the parties to which I am now and then invited, I find, as a matter of fact, that I get really much more pleasure by looking in at windows, and have a way of my own of seeing the world; and of summer evenings, when motors hurry through the late twilight, and the great houses take on airs of inscrutable expectation. I go owling out through the dusk, and, wandering toward the west, lose my way in unknown streets, an unknown city of revels. And when a door opens, and a bediamonded lady moves to her motor over carpets unrolled by powdered footmen, I can easily think her some great courtesan, or some half-believed duchess, hurrying to card tables and lit candles and strange scenes of joy. I like to see that there are still splendid people on this flat earth, and at dances, standing in the street with the crowd and stirred by the music, the lights, the rushing sound of voices, I think the ladies as beautiful as stars who move up those lanes of light past our rows of vagabond faces. The young men look like lords in novels, and if it has once or twice happened, people I know go by me, they strike me as changed and rapt beyond my sphere. And when, on hot nights, windows are left open, and I can look in at dinner parties as I peer through lace curtains and window flowers at the silver, the women's shoulders, the shimmer of their jewels, and the divine attitudes of their heads as they lean and listen, I imagine extraordinary intrigues and unheard-of wines and passions. The Church of England. I have my Anglican moments, and as I sat there that Sunday afternoon in the Palladian interior of the London church, and listened to the unexpressive voices chanting the correct service, I felt a comfortable assurance that we were in no danger of being betrayed into any unseemly manifestations of religious fervour. We had not gathered together at that performance to abase ourselves with furious hosannas before any dark creator of an untamed universe, no deity of freaks and miracles and sinister hocus-pocus, but to pay our duty to a highly respected Anglican First Cause, undemonstrative, gentlemanly, and conscientious, whom, without loss of self-respect, we could decorously praise. Consolation. The other day, depressed on the Underground, I tried to cheer myself by thinking over the joys of our human lot. But there wasn't one of them for which I seemed to care a button, not wine, nor friendship, nor eating, nor making love, nor the consciousness of virtue. Was it worth while, then, going up in a lift into a world that had nothing less trite to offer? Then I thought of reading, the nice and subtle happiness of reading. This was enough, this joy not dulled by age, this polite and unpunished vice, this selfish, serene, lifelong intoxication. The Kaleidoscope. I find in my mind, in its miscellany of ideas and musings, a curious collection of little landscapes and pictures, shining and fading for no reason. Sometimes they are views in no way remarkable, the corner of a road, a heap of stones, an old gate. But there are many charming pictures, too. As I read between my eyes and book, the moon sheds down on harvest fields her chill of silver. I see autumnal avenues with the leaves falling, or swept in heaps, and storms blow among my thoughts with the rain beating forever on the fields. Then winter's upward glare of snow appears, or the pink and delicate green of spring in the windy sunshine, or cornfields and green waters, and youths bathing in summer's golden heats. And as I walk about, certain places haunt me. A cathedral rises above a dark blue foreign town, the color of ivory in the sunset light. Now I find myself in a French garden full of lilacs and bees and shut-in sunshine, with the Mediterranean lounging and washing outside its walls. now in a little college library with busts and the green reflected light of Oxford lawns, and again I hear the bells, reminding me of the familiar Oxford hours. The Poplar. There is a great tree in Sussex whose cloud of thin foliage floats high in the summer air. The thrush sings in it, and blackbirds, who fill the late decorative sunshine with a shimmer of gold sound. There the nightingale finds her green cloister, and on those branches sometimes, like a great fruit, hangs the lemon-colored moon. In the glare of August, when all the world is faint with heat, there is always a breeze in those cool recesses, always a noise, like the noise of water among its lightly hung leaves. But the owner of this tree lives in London, reading books. End of Essay 29. Essay 30 of Modern Essays selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 30, Beyond Life, by James Branch Cabell. To my taste, Beyond Life, an all-night soliloquy put into the mouth of the author's alter ego, Charteris, is the most satisfying of Mr. Cabell's books. Its point of view is deftly sharpened, its manner is urbane and charming, without posture or allegorical pseudo-romantics. From this book I have taken the two closing sections, which form a beautiful and significant whole. James Branch Cabell, born in Richmond, Virginia, in 1879, graduated from William and Mary College in 1898. He had some newspaper experience in Richmond and on the New York Herald, and began publishing in 1904. Not until 1915, until Mr. McBride, the New York publisher, and his untiring literary assistant, Mr. Guy Holt, to whom much of Cabell's appreciation is due, began their work, did critics begin to take him at all seriously. Since that time Mr. Cabell's reputation has been enormously enhanced by the idiotic suppression of his novel Jurgen. The Cabell cult has been almost too active in zeal, but there can be no doubt of his very real and refreshing imaginative talent. I ask of literature precisely those things of which I feel the lack in my own life. I appeal for charity, and implore that literature afford me what I cannot come by in myself. For I want distinction for that existence which ought to be peculiarly mine, among my innumerable fellows who swarm about earth like ants. Yet which one of us is noticeably or can be appreciably different in this throng of human ephemera and all their millions and inestimable millions of predecessors and oncoming progeny? And even though one mote may transiently appear exceptional, the distinction of those who in their heydays are great personages, much as the Emperor of Lilliput overtopped his subjects by the breadth of Captain Gulliver's nail, must suffer loss with time, and must dwindle continuously until at most the man's recorded name remains here and there in sundry pedants' libraries. There were how many dynasties of pharaohs, each one of whom was absolute lord of the known world, and is to-day forgotten? Among the countless popes who one by one were adored as the regent of heaven upon earth, how many persons can to-day distinguish? And does not time breed emperors and czars and presidents as plentiful as blackberries, and as little thought of when their season is out? For there is no perpetuity in human endeavor. We strut upon a quicksand, and all that any man may do for good or ill is presently forgotten because it does not matter. I wail to a familiar tune, of course, in this lament for the evanescence of human grandeur and the perishable renown of kings; and indeed to the statement that imperial Caesar is turned to clay, and Mizraim now cures wounds, and that, in short, Queen Anne is dead, we may agree lightly enough, for it is, after all, a matter of no personal concern. But how hard it is to concede that the banker and the rector and the traffic officer, to whom we more immediately defer, and we ourselves, and the little gold heads of our children, may be of no importance either. In art it may so happen that the thing which a man makes endures to be misunderstood and gabbled over. Yet it is not the man himself. We retain the Iliad, but oblivion has swallowed Homer so deep that many question if he ever existed at all. So we pass as a cloud of gnats, where I want to live and be thought of, if only by myself, as a distinguishable entity. And such distinction is impossible in the long progress of suns, whereby in thought to separate the personality of any one man from all others that have lived becomes a task to stagger omniscience. I want my life, the only life of which I am assured, to have symmetry, or, in default of that, at least to acquire some clarity. Surely it is not asking very much to wish that my personal conduct be intelligible to me. Yet it is forbidden to know for what purpose this universe was intended, to what end it was set a-going, or why I am here, or even what I had preferably do while here. It vaguely seems to me that I am expected to perform an allotted task, but as to what it is I have no notion. And, indeed, what have I done hitherto in the years behind me? There are some books to show, as increment, as something which was not anywhere before I made it, and which, even in bulk, will replace my buried body, so that my life will be to mankind no loss materially. But the course of my life, when I look back, is as orderless as a trickle of water that is diverted and guided by every pebble and crevice and grass root it encounters. I seem to have done nothing with premeditation, but rather to have had things done to me. And for all the rest of my life, as I know now, I shall have to shave every morning in order to be ready for no more than this. I have attempted to make the best of my material circumstances always, nor do I see to day how any widely varying course could have been wiser or even feasible. But material things have nothing to do with that life which moves in me. Why, then, should they direct and heighten and provoke and curb every action of life? It is against the tyranny of matter I would rebel, against life's absolute need of food and books and fire and clothing and flesh to touch and to inhabit, lest life perish. No, all that which I do here or refrain from doing lacks clarity, nor can I detect any symmetry anywhere, such as living would assuredly display, I think, if my progress were directed by any particular motive. It is all a muddling through, somehow, without any recognizable goal in view, and there is no explanation of the scuffle tendered or anywhere procurable. It merely seems that to go on living has become with me a habit. And I want beauty in my life. I have seen beauty in a sunset, and in the spring woods, and in the eyes of diverse women, but now these happy accidents of light and color no longer thrill me. And I want beauty in my life itself, rather than in such chances as befall it. It seems to me that many actions of my life were beautiful very long ago, when I was young in an evanished world of friendly girls, who were all more lovely than any girl is nowadays. For women now are merely more or less good-looking, and, as I know, their looks when at their best have been painstakingly enhanced and edited. But I would like this life which moves and yearns in me to be able itself to attain to comeliness, though but in transitory performance. The life of a butterfly, for example, is just a graceful gesture, and yet in that its loveliness is complete and perfectly rounded in itself, I envy this bright flicker through existence. And the nearest I can come to my ideal is punctiliously to pay my bills, be polite to my wife, and contribute to deserving charities. And the programme does not seem, somehow, quite adequate. There are my books, I know, and there is beauty embalmed and treasured up in many pages of my books, and in the books of other persons, too, which I may read at will. But this desire inborn in me is not to be satiated by making marks upon paper, nor by deciphering them. In short, I am enamoured of that flawless beauty of which all poets have perturbedly divined the existence somewhere, and which life as men know it simply does not afford nor anywhere foresee. And tenderness, too. But does that appear a mawkish thing to desiderate in life? Well, to my finding, human beings do not like one another. Indeed, why should they, being rational creatures? All babies have a temporary lien on tenderness, of course, and therefrom children too receive a dwindling income, although on looking back you will recollect that your childhood was upon the whole a lonesome and much put upon period. But all grown persons ineffably distrust one another. In courtship, I grant you, there is a passing aberration which often mimics tenderness, sometimes as the result of honest delusion, but more frequently as an ambuscade in the endless struggle between man and woman. Married people are not ever tender with each other, you will notice. If they are mutually civil, it is much, and physical contacts apart, their relation is that of a very moderate intimacy. My own wife, at all events, I find an unfailing mystery, a sphinx whose secrets I assume to be not worth knowing; and, as I am mildly thankful to narrate, she knows very little about me, and evinces as to my affairs no morbid interest. That is not to assert that if I were ill she would not nurse me through any imaginable contagion, nor that if she were drowning I would not plunge in after her, whatever my delinquencies at swimming. What I mean is that, pending such high crises, we tolerate each other amicably, and never think of doing more. And from our blood kin we grow apart inevitably. Their lives and their interests are no longer the same as ours, and when we meet it is with conscious reservations and much manufactured talk. Besides, they know things about us which we resent. And with the rest of my fellows I find that convention orders all our dealings, even with children, and we do and say what seems more or less expected. And I know that we distrust one another all the while, and instinctively conceal or misrepresent our actual thoughts and emotions, when there is no very apparent need. Personally, I do not like human beings because I am not aware, upon the whole, of any generally distributed qualities which entitle them as a race to admiration and affection. But toward people in books, such as Mrs. Millamant, and Helen of Troy, and Bella Wilfer, and Melusine, and Beatrix Esmond, I may intelligently overflow with tenderness and caressing words, in part because they deserve it, and in part because I know they will not suspect me of being queer, or of having ulterior motives. And I very often wish that I could know the truth about just any one circumstance connected with my life. Is the phantasmagoria of sound and noise and color really passing, or is it all an illusion here in my brain? How do you know that you are not dreaming me, for instance? In your conceited dreams, I am sure, you must invent and see and listen to persons who for the while seem quite as real to you as I do now. As I do, you observe, I say. And what thing is it to which I so glibly refer as I? If you will try to form a notion of yourself, of the sort of a something that you suspect to inhabit and partially to control your flesh and blood body, you will encounter a walking bundle of superfluities, and when you mentally have put aside the extraneous things, your garments and your members and your body and your acquired habits and your appetites and your inherited traits and your prejudices and all other appurtenances which, considered separately, you recognize to be no integral part of you, there seems to remain in those pearl-colored brain cells, wherein is your ultimate lair, very little save a faculty for receiving sensations, of which you know the larger portion to be illusory. And surely, to be just a very gullible consciousness provisionally existing among inexplicable mysteries is not an enviable plight. And yet this life, to which I cling tenaciously, comes to no more. Meanwhile I hear men talk about the truth, and they even wager handsome sums upon their knowledge of it. but I align myself with jesting Pilate, and echo the forlorn query that recorded time has left unanswered. Then, last of all, I desiderate urbanity. I believe this is the rarest quality in the world. Indeed, it probably does not exist anywhere. A really urbane person, a mortal, open-minded and affable to conviction of his own shortcomings and errors, and unguided in anything by irrational blind prejudices, could not but in a world of men and women be regarded as a monster. We are all of us, as if by instinct, intolerant of that which is unfamiliar. We resent its impudence, and very much the same principle which prompts small boys to jeer at a straw hat out of season induces their elders to send missionaries to the heathen. The history of the progress of the human race is but the picaresque romance of intolerance, a narrative of how, what is it Milton says? Truth never came into the world but like a bastard to the ignominy of him that brought her forth, till time hath washed and salted the infant, declared her legitimate, and churched the father of his young Minerva. And I, who prattle to you, very candidly confess that I have no patience with other people's ideas unless they coincide with mine. For if the fellow be demonstrably wrong, I am fretted by his stupidity, and if his notions seem more nearly right than mine, I am infuriated. Yet I wish I could acquire urbanity, very much as I would like to have wings. For in default of it, I cannot even manage to be civil to that piteous thing called human nature, or to view its parasites, whether they be politicians or clergymen of popular authors, with one half the commiseration which the shifts they are put to quite certainly would rouse to the urbane. So I, in point of fact, desire of literature, just as you guessed, precisely those things of which I most poignantly and most constantly feel the lack in my own life. And it is that which romance affords her postulants. The philters of romance are brewed to free us from this unsatisfying life that is calendared by fiscal years, and to contrive a less disastrous illusion of our own personalities than many seek dispersedly in drink and drugs and lust and fanaticism, and sometimes in death. For beset by his own rationality, the normal man is goaded to evade the strictures of his normal life, upon the incontestable ground that it is a stupid and unlovely routine, and to escape likewise from his own personality, which bores him quite as much as it does his associates. So he hurtles into these very various roads from reality, precisely as a goaded sheep flees without notice of what lies ahead. And romance tricks him, but not to his harm. For be it remembered that man alone of animals plays the ape to his dreams. Romance it is undoubtedly who whispers to every man that life is not a blind and aimless business, not all a hopeless waste and confusion, and that his existence is a pageant, appreciatively observed by divine spectators, and that he is strong and excellent and wise, and to romance he listens, willing and thrice willing to be cheated by the honeyed fiction. The things of which romance assures him are very far from true, yet it is solely by believing himself a creature but little lower than the cherubim that man has by interminable small degrees become upon the whole distinctly superior to the chimpanzee. So that, however extravagant may seem these flattering whispers to-day, they were immeasurably more remote from veracity when men first began to listen to their sugared susurrus, and steadily the discrepancy lessens. To-day these things seem quite as preposterous to calm consideration as did flying yesterday. And so, to the Gradgrindians, romance appears to discourse foolishly, and incurs the common fate of prophets, for it is about to-morrow and about the day after to-morrow that romance is talking, by means of parables. And all the while man plays the ape to fairer and yet fairer dreams, and practice strengthens him at mimicry. To what does the whole business tend? Why, how in heaven's name should I know? we can but be content to note that all goes forward toward something. It may be that we are nocturnal creatures perturbed by rumors of a dawn which comes inevitably, as prologue to a day wherein we and our children have no part whatever. It may be that when our arboreal Propositus descended from his palm tree and began to walk upright about the earth, his progeny were forthwith committed to a journey in which today is only a way station. Yet I prefer to take it that we are components of an unfinished world, and that we are but as seething atoms which ferment toward its making, if merely because man, as he now exists, can hardly be the finished product of any creator whom one could very heartily revere. We are being made into something quite unpredictable, I imagine, and through the purging and the smelting we are sustaining by an instinctive knowledge that we are being made into something better. For this we know, quite incommunicably, and yet as surely as we know that we will to have it thus. And it is this will that stirs in us to have the creatures of earth and the affairs of earth, not as they are, but as they ought to be, which we call romance. But when we note how visibly it sways all life, we perceive that we are talking about God. End of Essay 30. Essay 31 of Modern Essays selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 31, The Fish Reporter, by Robert Cortes Holliday. This informal commentary on the picturesque humors of trade journalism is typical of Mr. Holliday's great skill in capturing the actual vibration of urban life. He has something of George Gissing's taste for the actuality of city scenes and characters, with rather more pungent idiosyncrasy in his manner of self-expression. Careful observers of the art of writing will see how much shrewd skill there is in the apparently unstudied manner. One of Mr. Holliday's favorite discussions on the art of writing is a phrase of Booth Tarkington's, "How to get the ink out of it." In other words, how to strip away mere literary and conscious adornment and to get down to a translucent portraiture of life itself in its actual contour and profile. We are told that Mr. Holliday, in his native Indianapolis, where he was born in 1880, was a champion bicycle rider at the age of 16. That triumph, however, was not permanently satisfying, for he came to New York in 1899 to study art. Lived for a while, precariously, as an illustrator, worked for several years as a bookseller in Charles Scribner's retail store, and passed through all sorts of curious jobs on Grub Street, among others book reviewer on the Tribune and Times. He was editor of the Bookman after that magazine was taken over by the George H. Doran Company, and retired to the genteel dignity of contributing editor in 1920 to obtain leisure for more writing of his own. Mr. Holliday has the genuine gift of the personal essay, mellow, fluent, and pleasantly eccentric. His walking-stick papers, Broome Street Straws, Turns About Town, and Peeps at People have that charming, rambling humor that descends to him from his masters in this art, Hazlitt and Thackeray. When Mr. Holliday was racking his wits for a title for Men and Books and Cities, that odd Barrovian chronicle of his mind, body, and digestion on tour across the continent, I suggested The Odyssey of an Oddity. He deprecated this, but I still think it would have been a good title, because strictly true. Men of genius, blown by the winds of chance, have been, now and then, mariners, barkeeps, schoolmasters, soldiers, politicians, clergymen, and what not. And from these pursuits have they sucked the essence of yarns, and in the setting of these activities found a flavor to stir and to charm hearts untold. Now, it is a thousand pities that no man of genius has ever been a fish reporter. Thus has the world lost great literary treasure, as it is highly probable that there is not under the sun any prospect so filled with the scents and colors of story as that presented by the commerce in fish. Take whale oil. Take the funny old buildings on Front Street out of paintings, I declare, by Howard Pyle, where the large merchants in whale oil are. Take salt fish. Do you know the oldest salt fish house in America, down by Quinty's Slip? Ah, you should. The ghost of old Long John Silver, I suspect, smokes an occasional pipe in that old place. And many are the times I've seen the slim shade of young Jim Hawkins come running out. Take Labrador cod for export to the Mediterranean lands, or to Puerto Rico via New York. Take herrings brought to this port from Iceland, from Holland, and from Scotland, mackerel from Ireland, from the Magdalen Islands, and from Cape Breton, crab meat from Japan, fish balls from Scandinavia, sardines from Norway and from France, caviar from Russia, shrimp which comes from Florida, Mississippi, and Georgia, or salmon from Alaska and Puget Sound and the Columbia River. Take the obituaries of fishermen. In his prime, it is said, there was not a better skipper in the Gloucester fishing fleet. Take disasters to schooners, smacks, and trawlers. The crew were landed, but lost all their belongings. New vessels, sails, etc. The sealing schooner Tilly B., whose career in the South Seas is well known, is reported to have been sold to a moving picture firm. Sponges from the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. To most people familiar only with the sponges of the shops, the animal as it comes from the sea would be rather unrecognizable. Why, take anything you please. It is such stuff as stories are. And as you eat your fish from the store, how little do you reck of the glamour of what you are doing. However, as it seems to me unlikely that a man of genius will be a fish reporter shortly, I will myself do the best I can to paint the tapestry of the scenes of his calling. The advertisement in the newspaper read, "Wanted, reporter for weekly trade paper." Many called, but I was chosen, though doubtless no man living knew less about fish than I. The newsstands are each like a fair, so laden are they with magazines in bright colors. It would seem almost as if there were a different magazine for every few 107th person, as the statistics put these matters, and yet it seems there is a very vast periodical literature of which we, that is, magazine readers in general, know nothing whatever. There is, for one, that fine old standard publication, Barrel and Box, devoted to the subjects and the interests of the coopering industry. There is, too, the Dried Fruit Packer and Western Canner, as alert a magazine as one could wish, in its kind. And from the home of classic American literature comes the New England Tradesman and Grocer. And so on. At the place alone where we went to press, 27 trade journals were printed every week, from one for butchers to one for bankers. The Fish Industries Gazette. Ah, yes. For some reason, not clear, though it is an engaging thing, I think, the word Gazette is the great word among the titles of trade journals. There is the Jeweller's Gazette, and the Woman's Wear Gazette, and the Poulterer's Gazette, of London, and the Maritime Gazette, of Halifax, and other gazettes quite without number. This word Gazette makes its appeal, too, curiously enough, to those who christen country papers, and trade journals have much of the intimate charm of country papers. The trade in each case is a kind of neighborly community, separated in its parts by space, but joined in unity of sympathy. Personals are a vital feature of trade papers. Walter Connor, who for some time has conducted a bakery and fish market at Hudson, New York, has removed to Fort Edward, leaving his brother Ed in charge of the Hudson place of business. The Fish Industries Gazette, as I say, was one of several in its field, in friendly rivalry with the Oyster Trade and Fishermen and the Pacific Fisheries. It comprised two departments, the Fresh Fish and Oyster Department, and myself. I was, as an editorial announcement said at the beginning of my tenure of office, a reorganization of our salt, smoked, and pickled fish department. the delectable mellow spirit of the country paper, so removed from the crash and whir of metropolitan journalism, rested in this too, that upon the Gazette I did practically everything on the paper except the linotyping. Reporter, editorial writer, exchange editor, make-up man, proofreader, correspondent, advertisement solicitor was I. As exchange editor did I read all the papers in the English language in eager search of fish news; and, while you are about the matter, just find me a finer bit of literary style evoking the romance of the vast wastes of the moving sea in Stevenson, Defoe, anywhere you please, than such a news item as this: "Captain Ezra Pound of the bark Elnora of Salem, Mass., spoke a lonely vessel in latitude this and longitude that, September 8. She proved to be the whaler Wanderer, and her captain said that she had been 9 months at sea, that all aboard were well, and that he had stocked so many barrels of whale oil." As exchange editor was it my business to peruse reports from Eastport, Maine, to the effect that one of the worst storms in recent years had destroyed large numbers of the sardine weirs there; to seek fish recipes of such savory sound as those for broiled red snapper, shrimps bordelaise, and baked fish croquettes; to follow fishing conditions in the North Sea occasioned by the Great War; to hunt down jokes of piscatory humor. "The man who drinks like a fish does not take kindly to water." Exchange. To find other fillers in the consular reports and elsewhere. "Fish culture in India." "1,800 miles in a dory." "Chinese carp for the Philippines." "Americans as fish eaters." And, to use a favorite term of trade papers, etc., etc. Then to paste up the winnowed fruits of this beguiling research. As editorial writer, to discuss the reports of the commission recently sent by Congress to the Pribilof Islands, Alaska, to report on the condition of our national herd of fur seals. To discuss the official interpretation here of the government ruling on what constitutes boneless codfish. To consider the campaign in Canada to promote there a more popular consumption of fish, and to brightly remark à propos of this that "a fish a day keeps the doctor away." To review the current issue of the Journal of the Fishery Society of Japan, containing leading articles on "Are Fishing Motor Boats Able to Encourage in Our Country?" and "Fisherman, the late Mr. H. Yamaguchi well known." To combat the prejudice against dogfish as food, a prejudice like that against eels, in some quarters eyed askance as calling cousins with the great sea serpent, as Juvenal says; to call attention to the doom of one of the most picturesque monuments in the story of fish, the passing of the pleasant and celebrated old Trafalgar Hotel at Greenwich, near London, scene of the famous ministerial whitebait dinners of the days of Pitt; to make a jest on an exciting idea suggested by some medical man that some of the features of a Ritz-Carlton hotel, that is, baths, be introduced in the forecastles of Grand Bank's fishing vessels; to keep an eye on the activities of our Bureau of Fisheries; to hymn a praise to the monumental new fish pier at Boston; to glance at conditions at the premier fish market of the world, Billingsgate; to herald the fish display at the Canadian National Exhibition at Toronto, and indeed, etc., and again, etc. As general editorial roustabout, to find each week a leader, a translation, say, from In Allgemeine Fischerei Zeitung, or Economic Circular No. 10, "Mussels in the Tributaries of the Missouri," or the last biennial report of the Superintendent of Fisheries of Wisconsin, or a scientific paper on "The Porpoise in Captivity," reprinted by permission of Zoologica of the New York Zoological Society; to find each week for reprint a poem appropriate in sentiment to the feeling of the paper. One of the Saltwater Ballads would do, or John Masefield singing of "The Whale's Way," or "Down to the White Dipping Sails," or Rupert Brooke, "And in that heaven of all their wish there shall be no more land," say fish. or a weather rhyme about mackerel skies when you're sure to get a fishing day, or something from the New York Sun about the lobster pots of Maine, or Oliver Herford in the Century to a goldfish, or best of all, an old song of fishing ways of other days. And to compile from the New York Journal of Commerce better poetry than any of this, tables, beautiful tables of imports into New York. October 15. From Bordeaux, 225 cases cuttlefish bone. Copenhagen, 173 packages fish. Liverpool, 969 barrels herring. 10 walrus hides, 2,000 bags salt. La Guayra, 6 cases fish sounds. Belize, 9 barrels sponges. Rotterdam, 7 packages seaweed. 9,000 kegs herring. Barcelona, 235 cases sardines. Bocas del Toro, 5 cases turtle shells. Genoa, 3 boxes corals. Tampico, 2 packages sponges. Halifax, 1 case seal skins. 35 barrels cod liver oil. 215 cases lobsters. 490 barrels codfish. Akureyri, 4,150 barrels salted herrings, and much more, beautiful tables of exports from New York to Australia (cleared September 1st), to Argentina, Haiti, Jamaica, Guatemala, Scotland, Salvador, Santo Domingo, England, and to places many more. And many other gorgeous tables, too, fishing vessels at New York. For one, listing the trips brought into this port by the Stranger, the Sarah O'Neill, the Normal, a farrago of charming sounds, and a valuable tale of facts. As make-up man, of course, so to dress the paper that the markets, Oporto, Trinidad, Puerto Rico, Demerara, Havana, would be together. That Nova Scotia notes, weather conditions for curing have been more favorable since October set in. Would follow Halifax Fish Market. Last week's arrivals were October 13, schooner Hattie Loring, 960 quintals, etc. That Pacific Coast notes, the tug Tatoosh will perform the service for the Seattle salmon packers of towing a vessel from Seattle to this port via the Panama Canal. Would follow canned salmon. That shellfish matter would be in one place, reports of salt fish where such should be, that the weekly tale of the canned fish trade politically embraced the canned fish advertising, and so on and so on. Finest of all, as reporter, to go where the fish reporter goes. There the sight-seeing cars never find their way, the hurried commuter has not his path, nor knows of these things at all. And there that racy character who, voicing a multitude, declares that he would rather be a lamp-post on Broadway than mayor of St. Louis, goes not for to see. Up Lower Greenwich Street the fish reporter goes, along an eerie, dark, and narrow way, beneath a strange, thundering roof, the L overhead. He threads his way amid seemingly chaotic architectural piles of boxes, of barrels, crates, casks, kegs, and bulging bags. Roundabout many great fetlocked draught horses, frequently standing or plunging upon the sidewalk, and attached to many huge trucks and wagons, and much of the time in the street he is compelled to go, finding the sidewalks too congested with the traffic of commerce to admit of his passing there. You probably eat butter and eggs and cheese. Then you would delight in Greenwich Street. You would feast your highly creditable appetite for these excellent things for very nearly a solid mile upon the signs of wholesale dealers and commission merchants in them. The letterpress, as you might say, of the fish reporter's walk is a noble paean to the earth's glorious yield for the joyous sustenance of man. For these princely merchants' signs sing of opulent stores of olive oil, of sausages, beans, soups, extracts, and spices, sugar, Spanish, Bermuda, and Havana onions, fine apples, teas, coffee, rice, chocolates, dried fruits and raisins, and of loaves and of fishes and of fish products. Lo, dark and dirty and thundering Greenwich Street is today's translation of the Garden of Eden. Here is a great house whose sole vocation is the importation of caviar for barter here. Caviar from overseas now comes, when it comes at all, mainly by the way of Archangel, recently put on the map, for most of us, by the war. The fish reporter is told, however, if it be summer, that there cannot be much doing in the way of caviar until fall, when the spoonbill start coming in; and on he goes to a great salt fish house, where many men in salt-stained garments are running about, their arms laden with large flat objects of sharp and jagged edge, which resemble dried and crackling hides of some animal curiously like a huge fish; and numerous others of the same are trundling round wheelbarrow-like trucks likewise so laden; where stacks of these hides stand on their tails against the walls, and goodness knows how many big boxes are containing, as those open show, beautifully soft, thick, cream-colored slabs, which is fish; and where still other men, in overalls stained like a painter's palette, are knocking off the heads of casks, and dipping out of brine still other kinds of fish for inspection. Here it is said by the head of the house, by the stove (it is chill weather) in his office like a shipmaster's cabin, "Strong market on foreign mackerel. Mines hinder Norway catch. Advices from abroad report that German resources continue to purchase all available supplies from the Norwegian fishermen. No Irish of any account. Recent shipment sold on the deck at high prices. Fair demand from the Middle West." So by stages on up to turn into North Moor Street, looking down a narrow lane between two long, bristling rows of wagons pointed out from the curbs, to the façades of the North River docks at the bottom, with the tops of the buff funnels of ocean liners and Whistlerian silhouettes of derricks rising beyond. Hereabouts are more importers, exporters, and producers of fish, famous in their calling beyond the celebrities of popular publicity; and he that has official entrée may learn, by mounting dusky stairs, half ladder and half stair, and by passing through low-ceilinged chambers, freighted with many barrels, to the sanctums of the fish lords, what's doing in the foreign herring way, and get the current market quotations, at present sky-high, and hear that the American shore mackerel catch is very fine stock. Then round about, with a step into the broad vista of homely Washington Street, and a turn through Franklin Street, where is the man decorated by the Imperial Japanese Government with a gold medal, if he should care to wear it, for having distinguished himself in the development of commerce in the marine products of Japan, back to Hudson Street. An authentic railroad is one of the spectacular features of Hudson Street. Here down the middle of the way are endless trains, stopping, starting, crashing, laden to their ears with freight, doubtless all to eat. Tourists should come from very far to view Hudson Street. Here is a spectacle as fascinating, as awe-inspiring, as extraordinary as any in the world. From dawn until darkness falls, hour after hour, along Hudson Street slowly, steadily moves a mighty procession of great trucks. One would not suppose there were so many trucks on the face of the earth. It is a glorious sight, and many men whose soul is not dead would jump with joy to see it. And the thunder of them all together as they bang over the stones is like the music of the spheres. There is on Hudson Street a tall, handsome building where the fish reporter goes, which should be enjoyed in this way. Up in the lift you go to the top, then you walk down, smacking your lips, for all the doors in that building are brimming with poetry, and the tune of it goes like this: Toasted Cornflake Company, Seaboard Rice, Chili Products, Red Bloom Grape Juice Sales Office, Puerto Rico and Singapore Pineapple Company, Sunnyland Foodstuffs, Importers of Fruit Pulps, Pimentos, Sole Agents, U.S.A. Italian Salad Oil, Raisin Growers, Log Cabin Syrups, Jobbers in Beans, Peas, Chocolate and Cocoa Preparations, Ohio Evaporated Milk Company, Bernese Alps and Holland Condensed Milk Company, Brazilian Nuts Company, Brokers Pacific Coast Salmon, California Tuna Company, and thus on and on. The fish reporter crosses the street to see the head of the Sardine Trust, who has just thrown the market into excitement by a heavy cut in prices of last year's pack. Thence, pausing to refresh himself by the way at a sign Agency for Reims Champagne and Moselle Wines, Bordeaux Clarets and Sauternes, over to Broadway to interview the most august person of all, dealers in fertilizer, fish scrap. These mighty gentlemen live, when at business, in palatial suites of offices, constructed of marble and fine woods and laid with rich rugs. The reporter is relayed into the innermost sanctum by a succession of richly clothed attendants; and he learns, it may be, that fishing in Chesapeake Bay is so poor that some of the fish factories may decide to shut down. Acid phosphate, it is said, is ruling at $13 FOB, Baltimore. And so the fish reporter enters upon the last lap of his rounds. Through perhaps the narrow crooked lane of Pine Street he passes, to come out at length upon a scene set for a sea tale. Here would a lad, heir to vast estates in Virginia, be kidnapped and smuggled aboard to be sold a slave in Africa. This is Front Street. A white ship lies at the foot of it. Cranes rise at her side. Tugs, belching smoke, bob beyond. All about are ancient warehouses, redolent of the Thames, with steep roofs and sometimes stairs outside, and with tall shutters, a crescent-shaped hole in each. There is a dealer in weather vanes. Other things dealt in hereabouts are these: chronometers, nautical instruments, wax gums, cordage and twine, marine paints, cotton wool and waste, turpentine, oils, greases, and rosin. Queer old taverns, public houses are here too. Why do not their windows rattle with a yo-ho-ho? There is an old house whose business has been fish oil within the memory of men. And here is another. Next, through Water Street, one comes in search of the last word on salt fish. Now the air is filled with gorgeous smell of roasting coffee. Tea, coffee, sugar, rice, spices, bags and bagging here have their home. And there are haughty bonded warehouses filled with fine liquors. From his white cabin at the top of a venerable structure comes the dean of the salt fish business. "Export trade fair," he says. "Good demand from South America." End of Essay 31. Essay 32 of Modern Essays, selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 32, Some Nonsense About a Dog, by Harry S.T. Dounce. Harry S.T. Dounce was born in Syracuse in 1889 and graduated from Hamilton College in 1910. His first job was a cub reporter on the journal that newspapermen affectionately call the Old Sun. The adjective is pronounced as though it were in italics. He was on the staff of the Syracuse Herald, 1912-14, spent a year in New Orleans writing short stories, and returned in 1916 to the magazine staff of the Sun. He was editor of the Sun's book review section, 1919-20. In 1920 he joined the staff of the New York Evening Post. My hand will miss the insinuated nose. Sir William Watson. But the dog that was written of must have been a big dog. Nibby was just a comfortable lapful, once he had duly turned round and curled up with his nose in his tail. This is for people who know about dogs, in particular little mongrels without pedigree or market value. Other people, no doubt, will find it disgustingly maudlin. I would have found it so before Nibby came. The day he came was a beautiful, bright, cool one in an August. A touring car brought him. They put him down on our corner, meaning to lose him, but he crawled under the car, and they had to prod him out and throw stones before they could drive on. so that when I came home I found with his mistress-elect a sort of pot-bellied bundle of tarry oakum, caked with mud, panting convulsively still from fright, and showing the whites of uncommonly liquid brown eyes and a pink tongue. There was tennis that evening, and he went along. I carried him over the railroad tracks. He gave us no trouble about the balls, but lay huddled under the bench where she sat, and shivered if a man came near him. That night he got chop bones, and she got a sensible homily on the unwisdom of feeding strays, and he was left outdoors. He slept on the mat. The second morning we thought he had gone. The third he was back, wagging approval of us, and intent to stay, which seemed to leave no choice but to take him in. We had fun over names. Jellywaggles, suggested from next door, was undeniably descriptive. Rags fitted, or Toby, or Nig, but they had a colored maid next door. Finally we called him Nibs, and soon his tail would answer to it. Cleaned up, scrubbed, the insoluble matted locks clipped from his coat, his trampish collar replaced with a new one bearing a license tag, he was far from being unpresentable. A vet once opined that for a mongrel he was a good dog, that a black cocker mother had thrown her cap over Scottish mills, so to speak. This analysis accounted for him perfectly. Always, depending on the moment's mood, he was either terrier or spaniel, the snap and scrap and perk of the one alternating with the gentle, snuggling indolence of the other. As terrier he would dig furiously by the hour after a field mouse. As spaniel he would read the breeze with the best nose among the dog folk of our neighborhood, or follow a trail quite well. I know there was retrieving blood. A year ago May he caught and brought me, not doing the least injury, an oriole that probably had flown against a wire and was struggling disabled in the grass. Nibby was shaggy, genteel black, burnt as to the moustache, grizzled as to the raggy fringe on his haunches. He had a white stock and shirt frill and a white forepaw. The brown eyes, full of heart, were the best part. His body coat was rough Scottish worsted, the little black pate was cotton soft like shoddy, and the big black ears were genuine spaniel silk. As a terrier he held them up smartly, and carried a plumy fish-hook of a tail. As a spaniel the ears drooped, and the tail swung meekly as if in apology for never having been clipped. The other day, when we had to say good-bye to him, each of us cut one silky tuft from an ear, very much as we had so often when he'd been among the burdocks in the field where the garden is. Burrs were by no means Nibby's only failing. In flea time it seems hardly possible that a dog of his size could sustain his population. We finally found a true flea-bane, but deserted one day, he was populous again the next. They don't relish every human. Me they did. I used to storm at him for it, and he used, between spasms of scratching, to listen admiringly and wag. We think he supposed his tormentors were winged insects, for he sought refuge in dark clothes-closets where a flying imp wouldn't logically come. He was willful, insisted on landing in laps when their makers wanted to read. He would make advances to visitors who were polite about him. He would get up on the living-room table, why and how, heaven knows, finding his opportunity when we were out of the house, and taking care to be upstairs on a bed, white, grimeable coverlets preferred, by the time we had the front door open. I used to slip up to the porch and catch through a window the diving flourish of his sinful tail. One of his faults must have been a neurosis, really. He had a hard life before we took him in, as witness the game hind leg that made him sit up side-saddle fashion, and 2 such scars on his back as boiling hot grease might have made. And something especially cruel had been done to him when asleep, for if you bent over him napping or in his bed, he would half rouse and growl, and sometimes snap blindly. We dreaded exuberant visiting children. 2 or 3 experiments I hate to remember now convinced me that it couldn't be whipped out of him, and once wide awake he was sure to be perplexedly apologetic. He was spoiled. That was our doing. We babied him abominably. He was for 2 years the only subject we had for such malpractice. He had more foolish names than Wog, that dog of Mrs. Stevenson's, and heard more little language than Stella ever did, reciprocating by kissing proffered ears in his doggy way. Once he had brightened up after his arrival, he showed himself ready to take an ell whenever we gave an inch, and he was always taking them and never paying penalties. He had conscience enough to be sly. I remember the summer evening we stepped outside for just an instant and came back to find a curious groove across the butter on the dining-room table and an ever so innocent Nibby in a chair in the next room. While we were at the table he was generally around it, bulldozing for tidbits. I fear he had reason to know that this would work. One fortnight, when his Missy was away, he slept on his old man's bed (we had dropped titles of dignity with him by then), and he rang the welkin hourly, answering far-away dog friends, and occasionally came north to lollop my face with tender solicitude, just like the fool nurse in the story, waking the patient up to ask if he was sleeping well. More recently, when a beruffled basket was waiting, he developed an alarming trick of stealing in there to try it, so I fitted that door with a hook, ensuring a crack impervious to dogs. And the other night I had to take the hook, now useless, off. We couldn't stand hearing it jingle. He adopted the junior member on first sight and sniff of him, by the way, would look on beaming as proudly as if he'd hatched him. The last of his iniquities arose from a valor that lacked its better part, an absurd mixture of Falstaff and bantam rooster. At the critical point he'd back out of a fuss with a dog of his own size; but let a police dog, an Airedale, a St. Bernard, or a big ugly cur appear, and Nibby was all around him, blackguarding him unendurably. It was lucky that the big dogs in our neighborhood were patient, and he never would learn about automobiles. Usually tried to tackle them head on, often stopped cars with merciful drivers. When the car wouldn't stop, luck would save him by a fraction of an inch. I couldn't spank that out of him either. We had really been expecting what finally happened for 2 years. That's about all. Too much, I am afraid. A decent fate made it quick the other night, and clean and close at hand, in fact, on the same street corner where once a car had left the small scapegrace for us. We tell ourselves how glad we are it happened as it did, instead of an agonal ending such as many of his people come to. We tell ourselves we couldn't have had him forever in any event, that some day, for the junior member's sake, we shall get another dog. We keep telling ourselves these things, and talking with animation on other topics. The muzzle, the leash, the drinking dish are hidden, the last muddy paw track swept up, the nose smudges washed off the favorite front window pane. But the house is full of a little snoofing, wagging, loving ghost. I know how the boy Thoreau felt about a hereafter with dogs barred. I want to think that somewhere, sometime, I will be coming home again, and that when the door opens, Nibby will be on hand to caper welcome. End of Essay 32. Essay 33 of Modern Essays selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 33, The 51st Dragon, by Heywood Broun. Heywood Broun, who has risen rapidly through the ranks of newspaper honor from sporting reporter and war correspondent to one of the most highly regarded dramatic and literary critics in the country, is another of these Harvard men, but as far as this book is concerned, the last of them. Broun graduated from Harvard in 1910, was several years on the New York Tribune, and is now on the World. There is no more substantially gifted newspaper man in his field. His beautifully spontaneous humor and drollery are counterbalanced by a fine imaginative sensitiveness and a remarkable power in the fable or allegorical essay, such as the one here reprinted. His book, Seeing Things at Night, is only the first fruit of truly splendid possibilities. If I may be allowed to prophesy, thus hazarding all, I will say that Heywood Broun is likely in the next 10 or 15 years to do as fine work, both imaginative and critical, as any living American of his era. Of all the pupils at the night school, Gawain le Cœur Hardy was among the least promising. He was tall and sturdy, but his instructors soon discovered that he lacked spirit. He would hide in the woods when the jousting class was called, although his companions and members of the faculty sought to appeal to his better nature by shouting to him to come out and break his neck like a man. Even when they told him that the lances were padded, the horses no more than ponies, and the field unusually soft for late autumn, Gawain refused to grow enthusiastic. The headmaster and the assistant professor of Pleasaunce were discussing the case one spring afternoon, and the assistant professor could see no remedy but expulsion. "No," said the headmaster, as he looked out at the purple hills which ringed the school, "I think I'll train him to slay dragons." "He might be killed," objected the assistant professor. "So he might," replied the headmaster brightly, but he added more soberly, "we must consider the greater good. We are responsible for the formation of this lad's character." "Are the dragons particularly bad this year?" interrupted the assistant professor. This was characteristic. He always seemed restive when the head of the school began to talk ethics and the ideals of the institution. "I've never known them worse," replied the headmaster. "Up in the hills to the south last week they killed a number of peasants, 2 cows and a prize pig. And if this dry spell holds, there's no telling when they might start a forest fire simply by breathing around indiscriminately." "Would any refund on the tuition fee be necessary in case of an accident to young Cœur Hardy?" "No," the principal answered judicially. "That's all covered in the contract. But as a matter of fact, he won't be killed. Before I send him up in the hills, I'm going to give him a magic word." "That's a good idea," said the professor. "Sometimes they work wonders." From that day on, Gawain specialized in dragons. His course included both theory and practice. In the morning there were long lectures on the history, anatomy, manners, and customs of dragons. Gawain did not distinguish himself in these studies. He had a marvelous versatile gift for forgetting things. In the afternoon he showed to better advantage, for then he would go down to the south meadow and practice with a battle-axe. In this exercise he was truly impressive, for he had enormous strength as well as speed and grace. He even developed a deceptive display of ferocity. Old alumni say that it was a thrilling sight to see Gawain charging across the field toward the dummy paper dragon which had been set up for his practice. As he ran he would brandish his axe and shout, "A murrain on thee!" or some other vivid bit of campus slang. It never took him more than one stroke to behead the dummy dragon. Gradually his task was made more difficult. Paper gave way to papier-mâché, and finally to wood. But even the toughest of these dummy dragons had no terrors for Gawain. One sweep of the axe always did the business. There were those who said that when the practice was protracted until dusk, and the dragons threw long, fantastic shadows across the meadow, Gawain did not charge so impetuously, nor shout so loudly. It is possible there was malice in this charge. At any rate, the headmaster decided by the end of June that it was time for the test. Only the night before a dragon had come close to the school grounds and had eaten some of the lettuce from the garden. The faculty decided that Gawain was ready. They gave him a diploma and a new battle-axe, and the headmaster summoned him to a private conference. "Sit down," said the headmaster. "Have a cigarette." Gawain hesitated. "Oh, I know it's against the rules," said the headmaster, "but after all, you have received your preliminary degree, you are no longer a boy, you are a man. Tomorrow you will go out into the world, the great world of achievement." Gawaine took a cigarette. The headmaster offered him a match, but he produced one of his own, and began to puff away with a dexterity which quite amazed the principal. "Here you have learned the theories of life," continued the headmaster, resuming the thread of his discourse, "but after all, life is not a matter of theories, life is a matter of facts. It calls on the young and the old alike to face these facts, even though they are hard and sometimes unpleasant. Your problem, for example, is to slay dragons." "They say that those dragons down in the South Wood are 500 feet long," ventured Gawaine timorously. "Stuff and nonsense!" said the headmaster. "The curate saw one last week from the top of Arthur's Hill. The dragon was sunning himself down in the valley. The curate didn't have an opportunity to look at him very long, because he felt it was his duty to hurry back to make a report to me. He said the monster, or shall I say the big lizard, wasn't an inch over 200 feet. But the size has nothing at all to do with it. You'll find the big ones even easier than the little ones. They're far slower on their feet and less aggressive, I'm told. Besides, before you go, I'm going to equip you in such fashion that you need have no fear of all the dragons in the world." "I'd like an enchanted cap," said Gawaine. "What's that?" answered the headmaster testily. "A cap to make me disappear," explained Gawaine. The headmaster laughed indulgently. "You mustn't believe all those old wives' stories," he said. "There isn't any such thing. A cap to make you disappear, indeed! What would you do with it? You haven't even appeared yet. Why, my boy, you could walk from here to London and nobody would so much as look at you. You're nobody. You couldn't be more invisible than that." Gawaine seemed dangerously close to a relapse into his old habit of whimpering. The headmaster reassured him. "Don't worry, I'll give you something much better than an enchanted cap. I'm going to give you a magic word. All you have to do is to repeat this magic charm once, and no dragon can possibly harm a hair of your head. You can cut off his head at your leisure." He took a heavy book from the shelf behind his desk and began to run through it. "Sometimes," he said, "the charm is a whole phrase or even a sentence. I might, for instance, give you to make the No, that might not do. I think a single word would be best for dragons." "A short word," suggested Gawaine. "It can't be too short or it wouldn't be potent. There isn't so much hurry as all that. Here's a splendid magic word. Rumplesnitz. Do you think you can learn that?" Gawaine tried, and in an hour or so he seemed to have the word well in hand. Again and again he interrupted the lesson to inquire, "And if I say Rumplesnitz, the dragon can't possibly hurt me?" And always the headmaster replied, "If you only say Rumplesnitz, you are perfectly safe." Toward morning Gawaine seemed resigned to his career. At daybreak the headmaster saw him to the edge of the forest and pointed him to the direction in which he should proceed. About a mile away to the southwest a cloud of steam hovered over an open meadow in the woods, and the headmaster assured Gawaine that under the steam he would find a dragon. Gawaine went forward slowly. He wondered whether it would be best to approach the dragon on the run, as he did in his practice in the south meadow, or to walk slowly toward him shouting "Rumplesnitz" all the way. The problem was decided for him. No sooner had he come to the fringe of the meadow than the dragon spied him and began to charge. It was a large dragon, and yet it seemed decidedly aggressive in spite of the headmaster's statement to the contrary. As the dragon charged, it released huge clouds of hissing steam through its nostrils. It was almost as if a gigantic teapot had gone mad. The dragon came forward so fast, and Gawaine was so frightened, that he had time to say "Rumplesnitz" only once. As he said it, he swung his battle axe, and off popped the head of the dragon. Gawaine had to admit that it was even easier to kill a real dragon than a wooden one, if only you said "Rumplesnitz." Gawain brought the ears home and a small section of the tail. His schoolmates and the faculty made much of him, but the headmaster wisely kept him from being spoiled by insisting that he go on with his work. Every clear day Gawain rose at dawn and went out to kill dragons. The headmaster kept him at home when it rained, because he said the woods were damp and unhealthy at such times, and that he didn't want the boy to run needless risks. Few good days passed in which Gawain failed to get a dragon. On one particularly fortunate day he killed 3, a husband and wife and a visiting relative. Gradually he developed a technique. Pupils who sometimes watched him from the hilltops a long way off said that he often allowed the dragon to come within a few feet before he said "Rumplesnitz." He came to say it with a mocking sneer. Occasionally he did stunts. Once, when an excursion party from London was watching him, he went into action with his right hand tied behind his back. The dragon's head came off just as easily. As Gawain's record of killings mounted higher, the headmaster found it impossible to keep him completely in hand. He fell into the habit of stealing out at night and engaging in long drinking bouts at the village tavern. It was after such a debauch that he rose a little before dawn one fine August morning and started out after his 50th dragon. His head was heavy and his mind sluggish. He was heavy in other respects as well, for he had adopted the somewhat vulgar practice of wearing his medals, ribbons and all, when he went out dragon hunting. The decorations began on his chest and ran all the way down to his abdomen. They must have weighed at least 8 pounds. Gawain found a dragon in the same meadow where he had killed the first one. It was a fair-sized dragon, but evidently an old one. Its face was wrinkled, and Gawain thought he had never seen so hideous a countenance. Much to the lad's disgust, the monster refused to charge, and Gawain was obliged to walk toward him. He whistled as he went. The dragon regarded him hopelessly but craftily. Of course it had heard of Gawain. Even when the lad raised his battle-axe, the dragon made no move. It knew that there was no salvation in the quickest thrust of the head, for it had been informed that this hunter was protected by an enchantment. It merely waited, hoping something would turn up. Gawain raised the battle-axe and suddenly lowered it again. He had grown very pale, and he trembled violently. The dragon suspected a trick. "What's the matter?" it asked with false solicitude. "I've forgotten the magic word," stammered Gawain. "What a pity!" said the dragon. "So that was the secret. It doesn't seem quite sporting to me, all this magic stuff, you know. Not cricket, as we used to say when I was a little dragon. But after all, that's a matter of opinion." Gawain was so helpless with terror that the dragon's confidence rose immeasurably, and it could not resist the temptation to show off a bit. "Could I possibly be of any assistance?" it asked. "What's the first letter of the magic word?" "It begins with an R," said Gawain weakly. "Let's see," mused the dragon. "That doesn't tell us much, does it? What sort of a word is this? Is it an epithet, do you think?" Gawain could do no more than nod. "Why, of course," exclaimed the dragon. "Reactionary Republican." Gawain shook his head. "Well, then," said the dragon, "we'd better get down to business. Will you surrender?" With the suggestion of a compromise, Gawain mustered up enough courage to speak. "What will you do if I surrender?" he asked. "Why, I'll eat you," said the dragon. "And if I don't surrender?" "I'll eat you just the same." "Then it doesn't mean any difference, does it?" moaned Gawain. "It does to me," said the dragon with a smile. "I'd rather you didn't surrender. You'd taste much better if you don't." The dragon waited for a long time for Gawain to ask why, but the boy was too frightened to speak. At last the dragon had to give the explanation without his cue line. "You see," he said, "if you don't surrender, you'll taste much better because you'll die game." This was an old and ancient trick of the dragon's. By means of some such quip he was accustomed to paralyze his victims with laughter, and then to destroy them. Gawain was sufficiently paralyzed as it was, But laughter had no part in his helplessness. With the last word of the joke the dragon drew back his head and struck. In that second there flashed into the mind of Gawaine the magic word "Rumplesnitz," but there was no time to say it. There was time only to strike, and without a word Gawaine met the onrush of the dragon with a full swing. He put all his back and shoulders into it. The impact was terrific, and the head of the dragon flew away almost 100 yards and landed in a thicket. Gawaine did not remain frightened very long after the death of the dragon. His mood was one of wonder. He was enormously puzzled. He cut off the ears of the monster almost in a trance. Again and again he thought to himself, "I didn't say Rumplesnitz." He was sure of that, and yet there was no question that he had killed the dragon. In fact, he had never killed one so utterly. Never before had he driven ahead for anything like the same distance. 25 yards was perhaps his best previous record. All the way back to the night school he kept rumbling about it in his mind, seeking an explanation for what had occurred. He went to the headmaster immediately, and after closing the door told him what had happened. "I didn't say Rumplesnitz," he explained with great earnestness. The headmaster laughed. "I'm glad you found out," he said. "It makes you ever so much more of a hero. Don't you see that? Now you know that it was you who killed all these dragons, and not that foolish little word, Rumplesnitz." Gawaine frowned. "Then it wasn't a magic word, after all?" he asked. "Of course not," said the headmaster. "You ought to be too old for such foolishness. There isn't any such thing as a magic word." "But you told me it was magic," protested Gawaine. "You said it was magic, and now you say it isn't." "It wasn't magic in a literal sense," answered the headmaster, "but it was much more wonderful than that. The word gave you confidence. It took away your fears. If I hadn't told you that, you might have been killed the very first time. It was your battle axe did the trick." Gawaine surprised the headmaster by his attitude. He was obviously distressed by the explanation. He interrupted a long philosophic and ethical discourse by the headmaster with, "If I hadn't a hit 'em all mighty hard and fast, any one of 'em might have crushed me like a " He fumbled for a word. "Eggshell?" suggested the headmaster. "Like a eggshell," assented Gawaine, and he said it many times. All through the evening meal people who sat near him heard him muttering, "Like a eggshell, like a eggshell." The next day was clear, but Gawaine did not get up at dawn. Instead, it was almost noon when the headmaster found him cowering in bed, with the clothes pulled up over his head. The principal called the assistant professor of Plaisance, and together they dragged the boy toward the forest. "He'll be all right as soon as he gets a couple more dragons under his belt," explained the headmaster. The assistant professor of Plaisance agreed. "It would be a shame to stop such a fine run," he said. "Why, counting that one yesterday, he's killed 50 dragons." They pushed the boy into a thicket above which hung a meager cloud of steam. It was obviously quite a small dragon. But Gawaine did not come back that night, or the next. In fact, he never came back. Some weeks afterward, brave spirits from the school explored the thicket, but they could find nothing to remind them of Gawaine except the metal parts of his medals. Even the ribbons had been devoured. The headmaster and the assistant professor of Plaisance agreed that it would be just as well not to tell the school how Gawaine had achieved his record, and still less how he came to die. They held that it might have a bad effect on school spirit. Accordingly, Gawaine has lived in the memory of the school as its greatest hero. No visitor succeeds in leaving the building today without seeing a great shield which hangs on the wall of the dining hall. 50 pairs of dragon's ears are mounted upon the shield, and underneath in gilt letters is "Gawaine le Cœur Hardy," followed by the simple inscription, "He killed 50 dragons." The record has never been equaled. End of Essay 33. End of Modern Essays selected by Christopher Morley.